Chapter 3 of The Wee Free Men by Sir Terry Pratchett. Chapter 3 Hunt the Hag. Miss Tick removed her hat, reached inside, and pulled a piece of string. With little clicks and flapping noises, the hat took up the shape of a rather elderly straw hat. She picked up the paper flowers from the ground and stuck them on carefully. Then she said, "Whew! You can't just let the kid go like that," said the toad who was sitting on the table. "Like what?" "She's clearly got first sight and second thoughts. That's a powerful combination." "She's a little know-it-all," said Miss Tick. "Right, just like you. She impressed you, right? I know she did, because you were quite nasty to her, and you always do that to people who impress you." "Do you want to be turned into a frog?" "Well, now let's see," said the toad sarcastically. "Better skin, better legs, likelihood of being kissed by a princess 100% improved. Why, yes, whenever you're ready, madame." "There are worse things than being a toad," said Miss Tick darkly. "Try it sometime," said the toad. "Anyway, I rather liked her." "So did I," said Miss Tick briskly. "She hears about an old lady dying because these idiots thought she was a witch, and she decides to become a witch so they don't try that again. A monster roars up out of her river, and she bashes it with a frying pan. Have you ever heard the saying, 'The land finds its witch'? It's happened here, I'll bet. But a chalk witch? Witches like granite and basalt, hard rock all the way down. Do you know what chalk is?" "You're going to tell me," said the toad. "It's the shells of billions and billions of tiny helpless little sea creatures that died millions of years ago," said Miss Tick. It's tiny, tiny bones, soft, soggy, damp. Even limestone is better than that. But she's grown up on chalk, and she is hard and sharp, too. She's a born witch." "On chalk, which is impossible." "She bashed Jenny," said the toad. "The girl has got talent." "Maybe, but she needs more than that." "Jenny isn't clever," said Miss Tick. "She's only a grade 1 prohibitory monster, and she was probably bewildered to find herself in a stream when her natural home is in stagnant water. There'll be much, much worse than her." "What do you mean, a grade 1 prohibitory monster?" asked the toad. "I've never heard her called that." "I am a teacher as well as a witch," said Miss Tick, adjusting her hat carefully. "Therefore, I make lists. I make assessments. I write things down in a neat, firm hand with pens of 2 colors. Jenny is one of a number of creatures invented by adults to scare children away from dangerous places." She sighed. "If only people would think before they make up monsters." "You ought to stay and help her," said the toad. "I've got practically no power here," said Miss Tick. "I told you, it's the chalk. And remember the red-headed men. A Nac Mac Feegle spoke to her, warned her. I've never seen one in my life. If she's got them on her side, who knows what she can do?" She picked up the toad. "Do you know what'll be turning up?" she continued. "All the things they locked away in those old stories. All those reasons why you shouldn't stray off the path, open the forbidden door, or say the wrong word, or spill the salt. All the stories that gave children nightmares. All the monsters from under the biggest bed in the world. Somewhere all stories are real and all dreams come true. And they'll come true here if they're not stopped. If it wasn't for the Nac Mac Feegle, I'd be really worried. As it is, I'm going to try and get some help. That's going to take me at least 2 days without a broomstick." "It's unfair to leave her alone with them," said the toad. "She won't be alone," said Miss Tick. "She'll have you." "Oh," said the toad. Tiffany shared a bedroom with Fastidia and Hannah. She woke up when she heard them come to bed, and she lay in the dark until she heard their breathing settle down, and they started to dream of young sheep shearers with their shirts off. Outside, summer lightning flashed around the hills, and there was a rumble of thunder. Thunder and lightning. She knew them as dogs before she knew them as the light and sound of a storm. Granny always had her sheepdogs with her, indoors and out. One moment they would be black and white streaks across the distant turf, And then they were suddenly there, panting, eyes never leaving Granny's face. Half the dogs in the hills were Lightning's puppies, trained by Granny Aching. Tiffany had gone with the family to the big sheepdog trials. Every shepherd in the chalk went to them, and the very best entered the arena to show how well they could work their dogs. The dogs would round up sheep, separate them, drive them into the pens, or sometimes run off, snap at one another, because even the best dog can have a bad day. But Granny never entered with thunder and lightning. She'd lean on the fence with the dogs lying in front of her, watching the show intently and puffing her foul pipe. And Tiffany's father said that after each shepherd had worked his dogs, the judges would look nervously across at Granny Aching to see what she thought. In fact, all the shepherds watched her. Granny never, ever entered the arena because she was the trials. If Granny thought you were a good shepherd, if she nodded at you when you walked out of the arena, if she puffed at her pipe and said, "That'll do," you walked like a giant for a day. You owned the chalk. When she was small and up on the wold with Granny, Thunder and Lightning would babysit Tiffany, lying attentively a few feet away as she played. And she'd been so proud when Granny had let her use them to round up a flock. She'd run about excitedly in all directions, shouting, "Come by," and "There," and "Walk up," and "Glory be." The dogs had worked perfectly. She knew now that they'd have worked perfectly whatever she'd shouted. Granny was just sitting there smoking her pipe, and by now the dogs could read her mind. They never took orders. They only ever took orders from Granny Aching. The storm died down after a while, and there was the gentle sound of rain. At some point, Ratbag the cat pushed open the door and jumped into the bed. He was big to start with, but Ratbag flowed. He was so fat that, on any reasonable flat surface, he gradually spread out in a great puddle of fur. He hated Tiffany, but would never let personal feelings get in the way of a warm place to sleep. She must have slept because she woke up when she heard the voices. They seemed very close, but somehow very small. "Cribbins, it's a very well sayin' find the hag, but what should we be looking for? Can ye tell me that? All these big jobs look just the same to me." "Not totally wee Gordy down at the fishin' said she was a big, big girl." "A great heap of help that is. I dunna think they're all big, big girls." "Ya pyra dafties, everyone knows a hag wears a pointy bonnet." "So they canna be a hag if they're sleepin' then?" "Hello," whispered Tiffany. There was silence, embroidered with the breathing of her sisters. But in a way Tiffany couldn't quite describe. It was the silence of people trying hard not to make any noise. She leaned down and looked under the bed. There was nothing there but the gazunder. The little man in the river had talked just like that. She lay back in the moonlight, listening until her ears ached. Then she wondered what the school for witches would be like and why she hadn't seen it yet. She knew every inch of the country for 2 miles around. She liked the river best, with the backwaters where striped pike sunbathed just above the weeds, and the banks where kingfishers nested. There was a heronry a mile or so upriver, and she liked to creep up on the birds when they came down there to fish in the reeds, because there's nothing funnier than a heron trying to get airborne in a hurry. She drifted off to sleep again, thinking about the land around the farm. She knew all of it. There were no secret places that she didn't know about. But maybe there were magical doors. That's what she'd make if she had a magical school. There'd be secret doorways everywhere, even hundreds of miles away. Look at a special rock, say by moonlight, and there would be yet another door. But the school now, the school. There would be lessons in broomstick riding and how to sharpen your hat to a point, and magical meals and lots of new friends. Is the barn asleep? I canna hear her movin'. Tiffany opened her eyes in the darkness. The voices under the bed had a slightly echoey edge. Thank goodness the gazunder was nice and clean. Right, let's Get oo out of this wee pot, then." The voices moved across the room. Tiffany's ears tried to swivel to follow them. "Hey, see here, it's a hoose, see, with wee cherries and things." They found the dollhouse, Tiffany thought. It was quite a large one, made by Mr. Block, the farm carpenter, when Tiffany's older sister, who already had 2 babies of her own now, was a little girl. It wasn't the most fragile of items. Mr. Block did not go in for delicate work, but over the years the girls had decorated it with bits of material and some rough and ready furniture. By the sound of it, the owners of the voices thought it was a palace. "Hey, hey, hey, where in the cushy stuff new? There's a bed in this room, with pillows." "Keep it doon. We don't want any of them to wake up." "Crivens, I'm as quiet as a wee moose. Arg, there's soldiers." "What d'ye mean, soldiers?" "There's redcoats in the room." They found the toy soldiers, thought Tiffany, trying not to breathe loudly. Strictly speaking, they had no place in the dollhouse, but Wentworth wasn't old enough for them, and so they'd got used as innocent bystanders back in those days when Tiffany had made tea parties for her dolls. Well, what passed for dolls? Such toys as there were in the farmhouse had to be tough to survive intact through the generations and didn't always manage it. Last time Tiffany had tried to arrange a party, the guests had been a rag doll with no head, 2 wooden soldiers, and 3/4 of a small teddy bear. Thuds and bangs came from the direction of the dollhouse. "I got one. Hey, pal, can your mammy sew? Stitch this. Arg, he's got a hade on him like a tree." "Crivens, there's a body here with no hade at all." "Aye, nae wonder, 'cause there's a bear. Feel me boot, ye washoon." It seemed to Tiffany that although the owners of the 3 voices were fighting things that couldn't possibly fight back, including a teddy bear with only 1 leg, the fight still wasn't going all one way. "I got him! I got him! You're gonna get a gummer, ya wee heart disease." "Someone bit me my leg! Someone bit my leg!" "Come here! Ach, you're fighting yourselves, ye idiots! I'm fed up with the wee Perriers." Tiffany felt Ratbag stir. He might be fat and lazy, but he was lightning fast when it came to leaping on small creatures. She couldn't let him get the whatever they were, however bad they sounded. She coughed loudly. "See," said a voice from the dollhouse, "you're woke them up again. I'm offski." Silence fell again, and this time Tiffany decided after a while it was the silence of no one there rather than the silence of people being incredibly quiet. Ratbag went back to sleep, twitching occasionally as he disemboweled something in his fat cat dreams. Tiffany waited a while and then got out of bed and crept toward the bedroom door, avoiding the 2 squeaky floorboards. She went downstairs in the dark, found a chair by moonlight, fished a book of fairy tales off Granny's shelf, then lifted the latch on the back door and stepped out into the warm midsummer night. There was a lot of mist around, but a few stars were visible overhead, and there was a gibbous moon in the sky. Tiffany knew it was gibbous because she'd read it in the almanac that gibbous meant what the moon looked like when it was just a bit fatter than half full, and so she made a point of paying attention to it around those times, just so she could say to herself, "Ah, I see the moon's very gibbous tonight." It's possible that this tells you more about Tiffany than she would want you to know. Against the rising moon, the downs were a black wall that filled half the sky. For a moment she looked for the light of Granny Aching's lantern. Granny never lost a lamb. That was one of Tiffany's first memories of being held by her mother at the window one frosty night in early spring, with a million brilliant stars glinting over the mountains, and on the darkness of the downs, the one yellow star in the constellation of Granny Aching zigzagging through the night. She wouldn't go to bed while a lamb was lost, however bad the weather. There was only one place where it was possible for someone in a large family to be private, and that was the privy. It was a 3-holer, and it was where everyone went if they wanted to be alone for a while. There was a candle in there, and last year's almanac hanging on a string. The printers knew their readership and printed the almanac on soft, thin paper. Tiffany lit the candle, made herself comfortable, and looked at the book of fairy tales. The moon gibbosed at her through the crescent-shaped hole cut in the door. She'd never really liked the book. It seemed to her that it tried to tell her what to do and what to think. Don't stray from the path. Don't open that door. But hate the wicked witch because she is wicked. Oh, and believe that that shoe size is a good way of choosing a wife. A lot of the stories were highly suspicious in her opinion. There was the one that ended when two good children pushed the wicked witch into her own oven. Tiffany had worried about that after that trouble with Mrs. Snapperly. Stories like this stopped people thinking properly, she was sure. She'd read that one and thought, excuse me, no one has an oven big enough to get a whole person in, and what made the children think they could just walk around eating people's houses in any case? And why does some boy too stupid to know a cow is worth a lot more than 5 beans have the right to murder a giant and steal all his gold, not to mention commit an act of ecological vandalism? And some girl who can't tell the difference between a wolf and her grandmother must either have been as dense as teak or come from an extremely ugly family. The stories weren't real, but Mrs. Snapperly had died because of stories. She flicked past page after page looking for the right picture, because although the stories made her angry, the pictures were the most wonderful things she'd ever seen. She turned a page, and there it was. Most of the pictures of fairies were not very impressive. Frankly, they looked like a small girls' ballet class that had just had to run through a bramble patch, but this one was different. The colors were strange. There were no shadows. Giant grasses and daisies grew everywhere, so the fairies must have been quite small, but they looked big. They looked like rather strange humans. They certainly didn't look much like fairies. Hardly any of them had wings. They were odd shapes, in fact. In fact, some of them looked like monsters. The girls in the tutus wouldn't have stood much chance. And the odd thing was that, alone of all the fairy pictures in the book, this one looked as if it had been done by an artist who had painted what was in front of him. The other pictures, the ballet girls and the romper suit babies, had a made-up, syrupy look. This one didn't. This one said that the artist had been there. At least in his head, Tiffany thought. She concentrated on the bottom left corner, and there it was. She'd seen it before, but she had to know where to look. It was definitely a little red-haired man, naked except for a kilt and a skinny vest, scowling out of the picture. He looked very angry and, Tiffany moved the candle to see more clearly, he was definitely making a gesture with his hand. Even if he didn't know it was a rude one, it was easy to guess. She heard voices. She pushed the door open with her foot to hear them better, because a witch always listens to other people's conversations. The sound was coming from the other side of the hedge, where there was a field that should have been full of nothing but sheep waiting to go to market. Sheep are not known for their conversation. She snuck out carefully in the misty dawn and found a small gap that had been made by rabbits, which just gave her a good enough view. There was a ram grazing near the hedge, and the conversation was coming from it, or rather somewhere in the long grass underneath it. There seemed to be at least 4 speakers who sounded bad-tempered. "Cribbins, ya want a coo beastie? No a ship beastie. Ach, one's as goo as t'other. Come on, lads, grab a holt o' a leg. Aye, all the coos are in the shed. We talk what we can. Keep it doon, will ya? Ach, who's listening? Okay, lads. Tan, tethra." The sheep rose a little in the air and bleated in alarm as it started to go across the field backward. Tiffany thought she saw a hint of red hair in the grass around its legs, but that vanished as the ram was carried away into the mist. She pushed her way through the hedge, ignoring the twigs that scratched at her. Granny Aching wouldn't have let anyone get away with stealing a sheep, even if they were invisible. But the mist was thick, and now Tiffany heard noises from the henhouse. The disappearing backward sheep could wait. Now the hens needed her. A fox had got in twice in the last 2 weeks, and the hens that hadn't been taken were barely laying. Tiffany ran through the garden, catching her nightdress on pea sticks and gooseberry bushes, and flung open the henhouse door. There were no flying feathers, and nothing like the panic a fox would cause, but the chickens were clucking excitedly, and Prunes, the cockerel, was strutting nervously up and down. One of the hens looked a bit embarrassed. Tiffany lifted it up quickly. There were 2 tiny, blue, red-haired men underneath. They were each holding an egg clasped in their arms. They looked up with very guilty expressions. "Ach, nu," said one, "it's the barn. She's the hag." "You're stealing our eggs," said Tiffany. "How dare you? And I'm not a hag." The little men looked at one another and then at the eggs. "What eggs?" said one. "The eggs you are holding," said Tiffany meaningfully. "What? These? These are eggs, are they?" said the one who'd spoken first, looking at the eggs as if he'd never seen them before. "There's a thing. And there was us thinking they was, stones." "Stones," said the other nervously. "We crawled under yon chooky for a wee bitty warmth," said the first one. "And there was all these things. We thought they was stones, which is why the poor fowl was clucking all the time." "Clucking," said the second one, nodding vigorously. "So we took pity on the poor thing and—" "Put the eggs back," said Tiffany slowly. The one who hadn't been doing much talking nudged the other one. "Best do as she says," he said. "It's a gang angly. Ye canna cross a Aching, and this one's a hag. She dinged Jenny, and no one ever done that afore." I didn't think of that." Both the tiny men put the eggs back very carefully. One of them even breathed on the shell of his and made a show of polishing it with the ragged hem of his kilt. "No harm done, mistress," he said. He looked at the other man, and then they vanished. But there was a suspicion of a red blur in the air, and some straw by the henhouse door flew up in the air. "And I'm a miss!" shouted Tiffany. She lowered the hen back onto the eggs and went to the door. "And I'm not a hag. Are you fairies of some sort? And what about our ship? I mean sheep," she said. There was no answer but a clanking of buckets near the house, which meant that other people were getting up. She rescued the fairy tales, blew out the candle, and made her way into the house. Her mother was lighting the fire and asked what she was doing up, and she said that she'd heard a commotion in the henhouse and had gone out to see if it was the fox again. That wasn't a lie. In fact, it was completely true. Tiffany was on the whole a quite truthful person, but it seemed to her that there were times when things didn't divide easily into true and false, but instead could be things that people needed to know at the moment and things they didn't need to know at the moment. Besides, she wasn't sure what she knew at the moment. There was porridge for breakfast. She ate it hurriedly, meaning to get back out into the paddock and see about that sheep. There might be tracks in the grass or something. She looked up, not knowing why. Ratbag had been asleep in front of the oven. Now he was sitting up, alert. Tiffany felt a prickling on the back of her neck and tried to see what the cat was looking at. On the dresser was a row of blue and white jars that weren't very useful for anything. They'd been left to her mother by an elderly aunt, and she was proud of them because they looked nice but were completely useless. There was little room on the farm for useless things that looked nice, so they were treasured. Ratbag was watching the lid of one of them. It was rising very slowly, and under it was a hint of red hair and two beady, staring eyes. It lowered again when Tiffany gave it a long stare. A moment later she heard a faint rattle, and when she looked up, the pot was wobbling back and forth, and there was a little cloud of dust rising along the top of the dresser. Ratbag was looking around in bewilderment. They certainly were fast. She ran out into the paddock and looked around. The mist was off the grass now, and skylarks were rising on the downs. "If that sheep doesn't come back this minute," she shouted to the sky, "there will be a reckoning." The sound bounced off the hills, and when she heard, very faint but close by, the sound of small voices. "What did the hag say?" said the first voice. "She said there'd be a reckoning." "Oh, Whaley, Whaley, we are in trouble new." Tiffany looked around, face red with anger. "We have a duty," she said to the air and the grass. It was something Granny Aching had said once when Tiffany had been crying about a lamb. She'd said, "We are as gods to the beasts of the field, my jigget. We order the time of their birth and the time of their death. Between times, we ha' a duty." "We have a duty," Tiffany repeated more softly. She glared around the field. "I know you can hear me, whoever you are. If that sheep doesn't come back, there will be trouble." The larks sang over the sheepfolds, making the silence deeper. Tiffany had to do the chores before she had any more time to herself. That meant feeding the chickens and collecting the eggs and feeling slightly proud of the fact that there were 2 more than there might otherwise have been. It meant fetching 6 buckets of water from the well and filling the log basket by the stove, but she put those jobs off because she didn't like doing them much. She did quite like churning butter, though. It gave her time to think. "When I'm a witch with a pointy hat and a broomstick," she thought as she pumped the handle, "I'll wave my hand and the butter will come just like that. And any little red-headed devils who even think about taking our beasts will be—" There was a slopping sound behind her where she'd lined up the 6 buckets to take to the well. One of them was now full of water, which was still sloshing backward and forward. She went back to the churning as if nothing had happened, but stopped after a while and went over to the flour bin. She took a small handful of flour and dusted it over the doorstep, and then went back to the churning. A few minutes later, there was another watery sound behind her. When she turned around, there was, yes, another full bucket, and in the flour on the stone doorstep there were just 2 lines of footprints, one leading out of the dairy and one coming back. It was all Tiffany could do to lift one of the heavy wooden buckets when it was full. "So," she thought, "they are immensely strong as well as being incredibly fast. I'm really being very calm about this." She looked up at the big wooden beams that sat across the room, and a little dust fell down as if somebody had quickly moved out of the way. "I think I ought to put a stop to this right now," she thought. "On the other hand, there's no harm in waiting until all the buckets are filled up. And then I'll have to fill the log box in the scullery," she said out loud. Well, it was worth a try. She went back to the churning and didn't bother to turn her head when she heard 4 more sloshes behind her, nor did she look around when she heard little whoosh-whoosh noises and the clatter of logs in the box. She turned to see only when the noise stopped. The log box was full up to the ceiling, and all the buckets were full. The patch of flour was a mass of footprints. She stopped churning. She had a feeling that eyes were watching her. A lot of eyes. Thank you," she said. No, that wasn't right. She sounded nervous. She let go of the butter paddle and stood up, trying to look as fierce as possible. "And what about our sheep?" she said. "I won't believe you're really sorry until I see the sheep come back." There was a bleating from the paddock. She ran out to the bottom of the garden and looked through the hedge. The sheep was coming backward, and at high speed. It jerked to a halt a little away from the hedge and dropped down as the little men let it go. One of the red-headed men appeared for a moment on its head. He huffed on a horn, polished it with his kilt, and vanished in a blur. Tiffany walked back to the dairy, looking thoughtful. When she got back, the butter had been churned. Not just churned, in fact, but patted into a dozen fat golden oblongs on the marble she used when she did it. There was even a sprig of parsley on each one. Are they brownies? She wondered. According to the fairy tales, brownies hung around the house doing chores in exchange for a saucer of milk. But in the picture, they'd been cheery little creatures with long, pointy hoods. The red-haired men didn't look as if they ever drunk milk in their lives. but perhaps it was worth a try. Well, she said aloud, still aware of the hidden watchers, that'll do. Thank you. I'm glad you're sorry for what you did. She took one of the cat saucers from the pile by the sink, washed it in the sink, filled it with milk from today's churn, then put it down on the floor and stood back. Are you brownies? She said. The air blurred. Milk splashed across the floor and the saucer spun around and around. I'll take that as a no then, said Tiffany. So what are you? There were unlimited supplies of no answer at all. She lay down and looked under the sink, and then peered behind the cheese shelves. She stared up into the dark, spidery shadows of the room. It felt empty, and she thought, I think I need a whole egg's worth of education, in a hurry. Tiffany had walked along the sheep track from the farm to the village hundreds of times. It was less than half a mile long, and over the centuries the carts had worn it down so that it was more like a gully in the chalk and ran like a milky stream in wet weather. She was halfway down when the susurrus started. The hedges rustled without a wind. The skylark stopped singing, and while she hadn't really noticed their song, their silence was a shock. Nothing's louder than the end of a song that's always been there. When she looked up at the sky, it was like looking through a diamond. It sparkled, and the air went cold so quickly that it was like stepping into an icy bath. Then there was snow underfoot, snow on the hedges, and the sound of hooves. They were in the field beside her. A horse was galloping through the snow behind the hedge that was now suddenly just a wall of white. The hoofbeat stopped. There was a moment of silence, and then a horse landed in the lane, skidding on the snow. It pulled itself upright, and the rider turned to face Tiffany. The rider himself couldn't face Tiffany. He had no face. He had no head to hang it on. She ran. Her boots slipped in the snow as she moved, but suddenly her mind was cold as the ice. She had 2 legs slipping on ice. A horse had twice as many legs to slip. She'd seen horses try to tackle this hill in icy weather. She knew she had a chance. She heard a breathy, whistling noise behind her and a whinny from the horse. She risked a glance. The horse was coming after her, but slowly, half walking and half sliding. Steam poured off of it. About halfway down the slope, the lane passed under an arc of trees, looking like crashed clouds now under their weight of snow, and beyond them, Tiffany knew, the lane flattened out. The headless man would catch her on the flat. She didn't know what would happen after that, but she was sure it would be unpleasantly short. Flakes of snow dropped on her as she passed under the trees, and she decided to make a run for it. She might reach the village. She was good at running. But if she got there, then what? She'd never reach a door in time, and people would shout and run about. The dark horseman didn't look like someone who'd take much notice of that. No, she had to deal with it. If only she'd brought the frying pan. Here, wee hag! Stand it ye still, right noo! She stared up. A tiny blue man poked his head out of the snow on top of the hedge. There's a headless horseman after me, she shouted. He'll no make it, hinny. Stand ye still. Look him in the eye. He hasn't got any eyes. Crivens, are ye a hag or no? Look him in the eyes he has-a got. The blue man disappeared into the snow. Tiffany turned around. The horseman was trotting under the trees now, the horse more certain as the ground leveled. He had a sword in his hand, and he was looking at her with the eyes he didn't have. There was the breathy noise again. Not good to hear. The little men are watching me, she thought. I can't run. Granny Aching wouldn't have run from a thing with no head. She folded her arms and glared. The horseman stopped as if puzzled, and then urged the horse forward. A blue and red shape, larger than the other little men, dropped out of the trees. He landed on the horse's forehead, between its eyes and grabbed an ear in each hand. Tiffany heard the man shout, "Here's a face full of dandruff for ye, yer bargy, courtesy of Big Yan," and then the man hit the horse between the eyes with his head. To her amazement, the horse staggered sideways. "All right," shouted the tiny fighter. "Big Tuffy, is ye? Once more with feelin'." This time the horse danced uneasily the other way, and then its back legs slid out from under it, and it collapsed in the snow. Little blue men erupted from the hedge. The horseman, trying to get to his feet, disappeared under a blue and red storm of screaming creatures. And vanished. The snow vanished. The horse vanished. The blue men, for a moment, were in a pile on the hot, dusty road. One of them said, "Ah, crivens! I kicked meself in me own haid!" And then they, too, vanished. But for a moment Tiffany saw blue and red blurs disappearing into the hedge. Then the skylarks were back. The hedges were green and full of flowers. Not a twig was broken, not a flower disturbed. The sky was blue, with no flashes of diamond. Tiffany looked down. On the toes of her boots, snow was melting. She was strangely glad about that. It meant that what had just happened was magical, not madness, because if she closed her eyes, she could still hear the wheezy breathing of the headless man. What she needed right now was people and ordinary things happening, but more than anything else, she wanted answers. Actually, what she wanted more than anything else was not to hear the wheezy breathing when she shut her eyes. The tents had gone, except for a few pieces of broken chalk, apple cores, some stamped down grass, and alas, a few chicken feathers. There was nothing at all to show that the teachers had ever been there. A small voice said, "Psst!" She looked down. A toad crept out from under a dock leaf. "Miss Tick said you'd be back," it said. "I expect there's some things you need to know, right?" "Everything," said Tiffany. "We're swamped with tiny men. I can't understand half of what they say. They keep calling me a hag." "Ah, yes," said the toad. "You've got Nac Mac Feegles. It snowed, and then it hadn't. I was chased by a horseman with no head, and one of the what did you say they were?" "Nac Mac Feegles," said the toad, "also known as pixies. They call themselves the wee free men. Well, one of them head-butted the horse. It fell over. It was a huge horse, too." "Ah, that sounds like a feegle," said the toad. "I gave them some milk, and they tipped it over." "You gave the Nac Mac Feegle milk?" "Well, you said they're pixies." "Not pixies. Pixies. They certainly don't drink milk." "Are they from the same place as Jenny?" Tiffany demanded. "No, they're rebels," said Toad. "Rebels? Against who?" "Everything." "Anything," said the toad. "Now pick me up." "Why?" "Because there's a woman at the well over there giving you a funny look. Put me in your apron pocket, for goodness sake." Tiffany snatched up the toad and smiled at the woman. "I'm making a collection of pressed toads," she said. "That's nice, dear," said the woman, and hurried away. "That wasn't very funny," said the toad from her apron. "People don't listen anyway," said Tiffany. She sat down under a tree and took the toad out of her pocket. "The Feegles tried to steal some of our eggs and one of our sheep," she said, "but I got them back." "You got something back from the Nac Mac Feegle?" said the toad. "Were they ill?" "No, they were a bit, well, sweet, actually. They even did the chores for me." "The Feegle did chores?" said the toad. "They never do chores. They're not helpful at all." "And then there was the headless horseman," said Tiffany. "He had no head." "Well, that is the major job qualification," said the toad. "What's going on, Toad?" said Tiffany. Is it the Feegles who are invading?" The toad looked a bit shifty. "Miss Tick doesn't really want you to handle this," it said. "She'll be back soon with help." "Is she going to be in time?" Tiffany demanded. "I don't know. Probably, but you shouldn't." "I want to know what is happening." She's gone to get some other witches, said the toad. She doesn't think you should. You'd better tell me what you know, Toad, said Tiffany. Miss Tick isn't here. I am. Another world is colliding with this one, said the toad. There, happy now? That's what Miss Tick thinks. But it's happening faster than she expected. All the monsters are coming back. Why? There's no one to stop them. There was silence for a moment. There's me, said Tiffany. That's the end of chapter 3.